Why did Noah, the only righteous man left on earth after the flood, become not only the world's first winemaker, but also the world's first recorded drunk? Why did Jesus change water into approximately 900 bottles of wine or 5,400 glasses at the wedding of Cana? Was that a little bit overkill? And what did the religious leaders of Jesus' day call him because of his drinking habits, and why didn't he defend himself? And finally, why is wine the only drink in the Bible that gets its own blessing prayer? Well, tonight you're going to get those tips and stories and more. Now, if you're watching this video on the replay, please get into the comments and type the word replay. Let me know where you're logging in from or what's in your glass. I do want to hear from you. And of course, if you're here with me on the live stream, get in there as well. I'm Natalie McLean, and I teach online food and wine pairing classes, and you've just joined one of the most passionate groups of wine lovers who gather every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern to talk to the most interesting people in the world of food and drink. Now, I'm live streaming this video for the first time on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, but it's based on a recording that we made for my podcast, Unreserved Wine Talk. Now, that said, I am here in the comments live, so get in there. Let me know what stories or tips you're enjoying, what questions you still have. I really do want to hear from you. All right, back to our guest. Mark Scarlata is the senior lecturer in Old Testament at St. Mellitus College, London. He is also the vicar chaplain at St. Edward, King and Martyr, Cambridge, and the director of St. Edward's Institute for Christian Thought. He holds a master's degree from Yale Divinity School and a PhD from Cambridge University, and he has spoken on wine and faith internationally and continues to write on those subjects. And he joins us now from Cambridge, England. Welcome, Mark. We're so glad to have you here with us.
It's great to be with you, Natalie. Thanks for having me on.
All right. So let's start off with, you actually grew up in Connecticut and worked as a pastor at a congregational church before crossing the Atlantic for a PhD at Cambridge. What pulled you all the way to England, whereas you could have stayed in the U.S. for your doctoral degree?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we were just at a kind of turning point in life. We had been at the church for about 7 years, and I had always wanted to go back and do a PhD after doing some of my master's level work for training. And so Cambridge just became the place. It was mainly it was where I got accepted, and so we.
Well, not a shabby place to get accepted.
Yeah, it was really lovely, and the good news was that my wife liked it because we were packing up our 2 children at the time. We have 3 now, but we were packing up our 2 children who were 2 and about 3 months old. So it wasn't the most ideal moment to leave. But I think once we got settled in Cambridge and realized just the beautiful place that it is, and just being able to walk and cycle everywhere, it was we haven't really looked back. And so after I finished my PhD and then got ordained in the church in England, the Church of England here, and then started working at my college in London, then kind of this led to that, and we've just been here ever since.
Well, terrific. Now, you're also a keen cyclist, and you've biked up some of the Tour de France's most brutal mountainous peaks, including the Alps and the Pyrenees. Has riding through vineyards shaped the way you read scripture? Has there been any overlap there?
Well, riding up mountains shapes the way you think about suffering and pain and all of those kinds of things.
Well, there's a good Christian concept.
So yes, exactly. So that's good kind of like self-punishment and self-inflicted punishment. But it is wonderful. But no, I love, I think that is probably one of the seeds, pardon the pun, but one of the seeds in writing the book is, ever since we've lived over here for the past kind of 20 years, we always, or almost always, holiday in France. And we usually try to go to the mountains or somewhere near, but we've always been near vineyards. And there is something absolutely wonderful on a summer's day of cycling through France, coming across a small village and just seeing a beautiful vineyard and, a beautiful church and all of these types of things. And I think France was really where I've, kind of had most of my schooling in wine. And so, there is something about that. There is something wonderful about connecting to the land and to the place. And one of the things that I've always tried to do when we're over there is you always try to buy wines from the local area, to taste the land, to taste the terroir, and get a sense of what it's like. And there's something beautiful about that experience. It's something that really lives with you, year in and year out, and you kind of recognize or you remember places, not only by the bike rides that we've done, but you remember them also by the wines that you've drunk in that area. And so so it's been good fun. But yes, I try to get on my bike as much as possible because that makes me feel less guilty about drinking wine in the evening after we've
Whatever
gone
helps.
on a long ride. Exactly.
A little confession, a little bike ride, whatever helps soothe the soul. But I agree with you, like being able to slow down when you're in wine country, whether you walk, run, bike, as opposed to just getting from point A to point B. It really does give you a sense of the land when you can do that. Now, your first 4 books were on Cain, Exodus, the Sabbath, and Leviticus. What made you realize that wine deserved its own full-length book?
Full-length treatment. Yes, I was in the midst of, and I still am in the midst of writing some books on Leviticus, and what ended up happening was I heard a podcast of another scholar who had written a book. Her name is Gisela Kreglinger, and she had written a book called The Spirituality of Wine. And I was listening to this podcast, and then so I picked up the book because I was always been fascinated with wine. And as I read it, myself being a biblical scholar, I realized that she was approaching wine from more of a spirituality and kind of a historical place. And so I thought, well, that's interesting. There's so many interesting kind of verses in the Bible, whether Old Testament or New Testament. And I said, I just kind of thought off the top of my head, I wonder if anybody's ever really kind of dug into this. And there were a few things out there, and there were some longer articles, and there were some other books that had been published kind of a while back, but nothing recent. And I thought, this would be, this would be a fascinating way to get into, one, just to get into a passion that I already had. And so to combine it with my biblical studies and my work was even better. And so yes, I got into it, and then, sent off a proposal to Cambridge University Press, and then they got back to me, and then it was accepted, and then kind of this led to that, and then the moment that I started digging into it, I mean, I honestly didn't think, even as I was writing the proposal, I honestly didn't think that I was going to be able to get that much out of it. I thought like, maybe I'll get a few chapters here and there, and I'll have to kind of extend them by doing other stuff, talking about, horticulture or something, something like that. But there was just so much there was so much information. I mean, there's so much, from anything, whether it was from the beginning of the Bible, whether it was from kind of wisdom literature or the Psalms, the songs in the Bible, whether it was the New Testament, whatever it was, there was just so much. And so much that had kind of gone really untouched, in the sense of most scholars, like if you go to other books, on particular verses, most scholars just kind of brush over the fact that wine is used, and they just kind of go on. They just kind of almost assume that it's just used. Whereas I think one of the things that was so fascinating about this study is that as I got deeper into it, one of the consistent things that you see in when wine is mentioned in the Bible is that, across the whole of the Bible, kind of from the beginning book, the first book is Genesis, until the last book of the Bible, and the New Testament is Revelation, you see this sense of wine is specifically tied to, this idea of God's salvation, this idea that God has given his people the peace and the protection and the fertility of the earth and the fertility of the vine to to live in their land and to rejoice and to celebrate their festivals, celebrate their offerings, celebrate all of these different things. And so that was one of these things that I just wasn't expecting. And I wasn't, it just wasn't something, this connection between wine and salvation hadn't really occurred to me until I really got into the topic itself.
Wow. And so wine and salvation. I mean, can you summarize it in a few sentences? Sorry, but
Yeah, no. It's a great question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's the sign of salvation. So it's the physical, tangible sign of God's presence with His people and His joy in His people. And so that's why the title of the book is Wine, Soil, and Salvation, is because one of the things that obviously anybody who's been in the wine world or kind of understands the whole notion of terroir and the wine's connection to the land. The moment that you get into wine is the moment you get into the soil in any case. But the same is true in the Bible. And it's this idea that where wine is present, it's kind of a physical, tangible sign of God's grace and of His goodness, because salvation, the experience of salvation, certainly in the Old Testament, is about being able to dwell in peace, being able to have a vineyard on your small plot of land, maybe a half an acre or something like that, of a vineyard, and to produce wine for the family, and and all these types of things. And so all of that kind of equates to this beautiful symbol of whether you have the cup of salvation, this idea that God kind of fills your cup to overflowing, or throughout the Old Testament and then into the New Testament, this idea of the feast, God preparing, well-aged wines for His people and all these types of things. There's just so many different things, but it just becomes this powerful symbol. And it does in the New Testament as well, but it becomes this powerful symbol of the sign that God is present, that He is pleased, He is happy with His people because He's given them this blessing from the earth and this blessing and this gift of wine. And as you said, that in the beginning, it goes back to Noah, and that's where the story the story for the Bible really starts when it comes to wine.
Sure. Absolutely, and we're going to get to Noah momentarily.
Okay.
But in your acknowledgments, you thank the Cambridge wine merchants who were, quote, ever willing to share my questions or answer my questions and guide me towards some excellent wines. Was there one specific bottle they introduced you to that opened up a passage of scripture for you, or that you paired while reading a particular passage?
Let's see. I don't know if there was one particular bottle. There was one particular grape that became a big fan among some of our church members. We've done some wine tastings, and we do other kind of receptions and stuff when we have wine afterwards. And there was one that we read. I think it was called Vesevo or something like that. But it was from the Falangina grape, so grown in Campania, around kind of just southern, just south of Rome. And it was funny because I decided at one point to go, as I was doing my research, I decided to go and look up a little bit more about the grape, and then I found that it was kind of an ancestor of some of these early Roman wines. And so the early name Falernium goes back to this wonderful story in Rome, in Campania, who there's a farmer called Falernus, and Dionysus, or Bacchus, the god, Bacchus and the Roman god of wine, comes down and he hears about this this man Falernus, and he goes he dresses up and pretends he's an old kind of ragged hobo, and he goes to him and asks him if he can take care of him. Goes to Falernus, and so Falernus invites him in and shows him hospitality, gives him a meal, gives him wine, and then Bacchus reveals himself and said, "You, Falernus, are a great man. You've hosted me, you've shown me your hospitality." And he said, "Your wine will be forever known in kind of throughout eternity," and whatnot. And it turns out that that Falernian wine was actually fairly popular among the Roman senators and even the emperor. But that was a really fun, kind of fun discovery of a great. I mean, it was a really lovely bottle, and then how it tied into the book. So that was good fun. But I mean, they kind of have never led me astray. My lovely Cambridge wine merchants.
Those merchants, and that story has resonance with the biblical stories of you never know if Jesus is visiting you in the guise of the poor or whatever. Yes. So it all sort of weaves together. What was the most difficult part in writing this book?
Let's see. Do you know, I don't, it's funny because other books that I've written, just purely on kind of books of the Bible or Old Testament texts have been much more difficult than this one. This one was just, it was so much fun. I mean, it was
Cool.
just, I was
Yeah.
learning, I was
Tied into
learning
your
new stuff.
passion.
I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, it really wasn't difficult in the sense of, I mean, it just took time, but it was one of these, it was one of these books that was so much fun because it covered such a broad range of material. I mean, I was getting into kind of plant biology and care for the soil and regenerative agriculture, and I was just getting exposed to all these new different things. And so, yeah, so throughout the book, it was just so much fun. And it was, and obviously, the more that you write about wine, the more at the end of an evening, you just think, well, now I have to go taste a glass because I have to kind of,
Yes.
I have to
It's
experience what I've been
irresistible.
writing about all day. And so no, it really wasn't a difficult book. I mean, it was really probably the easiest book that I've ever written in the sense of it was just never, I just never found it burdensome. There was always something new. And I was always listening to, podcasts on wine and your podcast and other podcasts and just, constantly reminding myself of why, this fruit of the vine, this very simple drink that goes back, almost 5,000 to 6,000 years, is still such an important thing for so many people. I mean, we have the most kind of the most amazing global wine industry. But even if you didn't, it's still, it's just still one of these remarkable drinks that, that cheers the hearts of gods and, and men,
And men,
as the
yes,
passage
that's true.
says.
Well, yeah, yeah. And that leads me right into, you open your book with the fascinating question, why wine and not milk, olive oil, honey, dates, pomegranates? What's the one sentence answer that makes wine impossible to swap? Is it simply that the buzz as well as the sensuality of it, or what is it?
I mean, I'm sure that it has to do with the alcohol. I mean, I'm sure that's part of it. And wine eases kind of eases the toil, as is said in Noah. Noah's dad predicts that, Noah will kind of ease humanity of their toil that has come from the whole story of the Garden of Eden. And so there is something about, and you see this actually in Greek literature as well, and in Roman literature, this idea of wine as something that eases the burden of humanity. Life can just be very difficult, but to sit down at the end of a day, whether you're doing agriculture or whether, I mean, most people were working in agriculture back in the day. But there's something about that, that relaxation that it brings, but it's also the joy, I think, and I think this is part of the salvation bit that we were talking about before. It's the joy. There's this wonderful, well, it's not a wonderful passage because the guy dies in the end, but I can't remember
There's a lot of that going on in the Bible.
which person is killed. But they say when there's a phrase in Hebrew that says, when the person's heart is merry, and so the literal translation of it is just tov lev, which just means good heart. So it literally means that your heart, after drinking a few glasses of wine, your heart is good. Like it's merry. It's in a lovely place. And so
Right.
that kind of cheerfulness and that joy, comes out in the celebration of feasts and the celebration of festivals, of weddings, and all of this kind of stuff. I mean, there was a wonderful quote from Pope Francis. I don't know if you came across this one, but he was speaking. I think he was speaking to the wine guild or something of that nature in Italy, and he said something to the effect of, how could we live without wine? You can't get to the end of the wedding, or in the midst of a wedding celebration, and then offer everybody tea. You
Right.
have to have wine.
That'd be a bit of a
And I
letdown.
thought, yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, he's nailed it on the head. It didn't matter if it was 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago, or if it's today. It's like, it's the same. So, yeah, so I think that's the reason why wine holds kind of a special place in the scriptures. Now, certainly things like oil and honey and milk and, and other fruits and things like that are obviously part, and bread being a main one for sustenance. But I mean, there are other kind of agricultural goods that do express the goodness of the land, the produce of the land, God's blessing and things like that. But there is something very different, I think, about wine, and how it works both on a physical level, but then also on a metaphorical level, which I think is really important.
Yeah, there is so much about that, Jesus being the vine and so on. But let's dig in at the beginning. You mentioned that archaeologists traced the earliest evidence of domesticated grape wine to Zagros, which the mountains of present-day Iran. How does that intersect with Noah's story as the ark lands on Mount Ararat in the same region? How did that all come together?
It was a long time ago. I don't know. I don't know how it came together, but I do know kind of what the storyline is. Yes, so you're exactly right. So Noah is if people don't know the story, or listeners don't know the story, after the kind of fall in the Garden of Eden, everything kind of just goes completely pear-shaped in the Bible, and people are doing all sorts of bad stuff, and everything is kind of evil and wicked except for Noah. And Noah has been predicted and prophesied by his dad to be the one who will ease them of their toil. He will bring something from the earth to ease humanity from the toil caused by Adam, this first garden dweller. And so you're exactly right. So he lands on Mount Ararat, which is kind of in I can't remember if it's in Armenia. It's like northern Iran. I think it might be Armenia, and
Okay.
that area of the Zagros Mountains. And then it said that Moses is the one who Moses, sorry, Noah is the one who kind of becomes the first kind of viticulturist. He figures out how to create these vines that are what we would call vitis vinifera. These hermaphroditic vines that can that have yeasts on their yeast on the
Yeah.
grapes, and then they can produce, be crushed and produced into wine. And so yes, but I mean the fascinating thing is that the biblical authors in their stories compare, or kind of frame this within a story that is all about the complete and utter renewal of the earth and the renewal of humanity. And that was
Right.
that was the thing that
After the
fascinated
flood,
me
yeah.
so much is Noah's connection to the soil. And there's this wonderful verse in Genesis that says Noah, the way that I translate it is Noah became a man of the soil. And so, we don't know what he was before. We're not told what he was before. He's a good carpenter because he built the ark, but he becomes a man of the soil, meaning that there's something that he does in producing this vine that can then produce grapes to make wine, that kind of renews this connection between humanity and the soil, which we see kind of, we'll go into all the details, but we see back with the creation of Adam, or Adam, this creature who comes from the soil. God kind of scoops up the soil and breathes into it, and this human being becomes a living being. And so that was one of the things that I thought was just so fascinating in terms of our human identities, and that connection with wine and the soil and the land and place, because I think there's so much about not just the vine and its terroir. It's all these things that affect the production of a grape, whether it's the land or the soil or the wind, sun, rain, all these types of things. But when you transfer that idea to human beings, I think that's what the Bible is doing. It's saying, we are connected to this soil, and not only just the soil, but our creation, the world around us. And the way we take root in our particular place is how we as human beings grow and bear fruit. And so I thought that was just
Right.
just an amazing connection between kind of the land and then who we are as human beings, or at least who the Bible understands us to be as human beings in God's creation.
Absolutely, and I don't know if there's an etymological root, humus, not the
Yes.
spread, the dip, but the humus, the dirt,
Yes.
and
Yes, yes,
human.
yes.
And then there's ashes to ashes, dust to dust. You came from the earth, you'll return to the earth. When you die. I mean,
Yeah.
that whole thing, that whole circle of
Yeah,
life,
I
soil.
mean, there's a
Yeah.
wonderful wordplay. And so in the Hebrew, I talk about this in the book. In the Hebrew, so we often call the first person who lived in the Garden of Eden Adam, and Adam and his wife Eve. But Adam it's a little bit deceptive because it's not a personal name in the very beginning of Genesis. Adam means kind of human, but it's a wordplay on the fact that Adam came from the soil, which is called Adamah. So it's Adam comes from Adamah. So the wordplay itself kind of is, the biblical author's way of saying, hey, we are literally from the soil. Like, that's it. This is where we've come from, and this is our connect, and this is one of the most important connections in our lives. And, and what you realize as you kind of get into kind of some of this, this biblical ideology and theology, then when you start looking at kind of the nature of our world, the nature of digital technologies, all of these different types of things that leave us with a sense of rootlessness, this sense of, that we have no roots. Yeah, exactly. Then you start thinking, oh gosh, where are we in this in this world, and what are we doing to kind of establish those roots in our lives and establish, kind of this idea of being rooted and producing fruit in the places where we live and in our communities and things like that.
Right. Wow. And now there's a wonderful story where Satan slaughters a lamb, a lion, a pig, and a donkey under Noah's first vine, letting their blood flow into the soil to show what wine does at each stage of drunkenness. Tell us that in the various stages. Are we mimicking the actions of each of those animals as we get more imbibe more?
That's a rabbinic saying. That was not from the Bible. So that was a much later interpretation. But it is hilarious. I love that. That's why I put it in the book, because I think when I read it out of the rabbis, I was just laughing so hard, because it was kind of, I don't remember what pages of the book. I have to go back and look at the thing, but it was kind of like when you first drink it, you feel like strong as a lion, but then you become kind of as stupid as a monkey, and then finally, I think, would you end as a pig or something like that? I forgot what it was, but Probably. It was just kind of the stages of kind of getting to the point of complete inebriation were described fairly well, I thought. It's just a very clever way of kind of saying this is what happens if you drink too much, basically.
Absolutely. And then there's another story in either Greek or Roman mythology, Bacchus or Dionysus, where he's carrying a vessel of wine. And I don't know, there's something about different animals, and it's that transformation too, the more you're affected by alcohol. I can't recall it right now what it was, but there's so many intertwinings here. But the biblical text reports Noah's drunkenness without piling on shame. And you point out he was in the privacy of his tent when he was drinking. Why have some commentators across time kind of shamed Noah for for his drinking when the text doesn't?
Yeah, no, I think it's I think just because, essentially because in the rest of the Bible, drunkenness is always condemned. I mean, there's really no place apart from the story of Noah where drunkenness isn't almost isn't explicitly condemned. So that's probably why people kind of come to that interpretation. But I was surprised, though, because when I read most of the rabbinic texts, kind of the rabbis' interpretations, the Jewish rabbis, most of them all said, look, Noah had no idea. You're not culpable if you don't know what's going to happen, because this was, this is the first time apparently, that he drank wine. And then later there was a medieval theologian called Thomas Aquinas, and he basically said the same thing. He said, look, if you drink something or take something and you don't know what the effects are going to be, it's not sinful. You're not culpable for that. But I think just because throughout the rest of the Bible, and because of all sorts of movement, all of the teetotaling or abstinence movements, and and all that blah blah blah, I think people just kind of just assume that if Noah was drunk, passed out. I mean, interestingly enough, in that text, I think for a lot of scholars will say the real issue is that his sons didn't cover him. They didn't respect him, and they didn't because he was naked, naked, passed out, drunk, and naked. Okay. Of a doubly shameful thing. But his sons, who are meant to honor their parents, they didn't kind of come in and cover him, and so that's why they get the blame. Get the blame. But it is quite an interesting story.
Yeah, I wonder if Thomas Aquinas was a drinker too. Was he the one who said,
He
God made me
was.
good, but just not yet? He wanted another
I
bender or
don't know.
something? I don't know.
I don't know if that was his comment, but he did have. Oh, and a friend of mine, I can't remember the quote. I mean, there's one in the book I think I have that he says something that like drinking to the point of hilarity or cheerfulness is not sinful. And there was another really good quote that I just can't remember off the top of my head. But no, Aquinas definitely, loved his Italian wines. He was, he was certainly not promoting abstinence, as did many of the monks across Europe. I mean, even Saint Benedict, who
Sure.
is kind of the founder of the monastic movement in the Western world,
Yeah.
said, his monks could have, I forget what it was something like half a liter or something, or a bottle a day or something like that, or maybe it was a
Daily
little bit less
rations.
than that.
Yeah.
I can't remember. But it
Oh,
was just
sure. Well,
part
the
of life.
Benedictines, yeah, yeah, absolutely. And the Benedictines and the Cistercians, especially, really cultivated winemaking and
Exactly.
advanced the process, the technology,
Yeah.
everything. I mean,
Yeah.
Dom Perignon was a monk.
Exactly, exactly. And we wouldn't have half of the vineyards in Europe were it not for the monasteries. I mean, we just wouldn't have the
Right.
same. I mean, there would be there would be no Burgundy, as far as we know, without kind of the lives of faithful men and women who gave their life to monasticism, and yet also produced some of the greatest wines that we have today still. So yeah, anyway, it's fascinating, isn't
That's
it?
true. It is. It is. Now you're, as we mentioned, a vicar chaplain at St. Edward King and Martyr in Cambridge, one of the oldest churches in the city. How did your congregation react when you started talking about Noah's hangovers or Jesus the wine drinker? I mean, did that prompt some discussion?
Yeah, it's funny over here in the UK. So having grown up in the States, and having grown up in the church, wine is always kind of, wine and maybe just alcohol in general was always kind of a, I mean, not quite a taboo topic, but it certainly wasn't something that anyone felt particularly open to discuss or talk about. It was just something, if it was always the default, at least in my church circles, was don't have wine or don't have beer because, you might lead someone away or something like that. But what I found over here in the UK is that the British culture is very different. They have a much more,
Less
and
puritanical.
especially even in the, yeah, exactly. All the Puritans left this country and went to the States. All the drinkers stuck around.
Teetotalers.
Exactly. But so yeah, so I found that most people just loved it. I mean, most people really. I mean, we've done some wine tastings at my church, and most people really enjoy the fact that not just that they can justify their drinking, because wine is so prominent in the Bible, but just because they kind of feel a sense of, like no one ever really speaks about wine as a blessing or as something that is a sign of God's salvation or something that connects us to, ecology and the land and creation and all of these different things. So I think a lot of people were just kind of more fascinated by it, and then probably also a little bit of justification in it was fine that at church lunches, we break out, bottles of wine and those kinds of things. So
That's great. That's great. I go to your church, but it's a little far for me to go.
yeah, exactly.
And now you suggest readers pair the first chapters of your book with a Georgian, that'd be the country Georgia, not the state, orange wine, fermented in Quiveri, those ancient beeswax-lined clay vessels buried underground. Tell us what drinking one of those wines teaches a person that reading the text alone never could.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great. Yeah, so it doesn't necessarily have to be an orange wine, but to drink anything kind of produced in that way, in the traditional wine, the way probably wines were made during Jesus's day and prior to that, I think there is something about the experience of drinking a wine and thinking, and the experience of feeling the wine, tasting the wine, smelling the wine, and then thinking historically, this could have been, it's probably different, but, this could have been the type of experience that someone, that the disciples sitting around the table with Jesus at the Last Supper would have experienced, or, or whoever in the Bible who would have experienced it. And so I think there is something critical about that tasting kind of tasting history.
Right.
I was going to tell you, when we were talking about the Falangina grape, right? And
Right.
it was really fun. We used to take some of our students. So I train students who are in the ordination process who are going to become priests in the Church of England. And so we take a group to Rome, or we have taken in the past, and we did several trips to Rome for kind of an ecumenical type of trip. And anyway, one of the most delightful kind of experiences was going to our guest house, and we had kind of toured around. We look at all the churches and the church history and some of the art in the churches and the different periods, and all of these different types of things, from early Christianity to kind of Renaissance and so forth. And there's something about kind of going into churches, and you can experience the church, and that's fine. But there was something about sitting on. So it was kind of 8 o'clock or something, or 7 o'clock in the evening, and we were up on the balcony of our guest house. And in Rome, when you go up to the very, very top, usually they have kind of some chairs you can just go and hang out on the roof. And so we were sitting there, and so we opened kind of a prosecco to start, but then we opened a couple bottles of Falangina, and I said, it was so fun. I said, we've kind of seen Christianity through the lens of churches and things of that nature, but now, I want you to taste, the history and taste what, might have been a historical grape that the first Christians in Rome would have drank. Like maybe they had even used it for their first celebrations of the Eucharist. But there was something about then tasting the wine and looking out, and we had this beautiful view. The sun was setting down behind the big dome of St. Peter's, and there was just something about the kind of physical experience of that made the history kind of just come alive. And I think you're exactly right. When you have that drink in hand, there is something that it kind of evokes this sensual response, and a response that's connected to our memories, to our bodies, to our minds, all of these types of things. And that's what I love about wine. I think some of my scholarly, friends kind of laughed at me when I put a wine pairing with the chapters in the beginning, because they thought this is like not very, not very academic or whatnot. And I thought, yeah, but actually, to just read or just to write a book on wine in the Bible and to not think through kind of the physical experiences of wine, I think you just miss half of what the Bible is actually saying about the topic.
Be very dry, yes.
So yeah, exactly. It wouldn't be very fun.
No, and I think you get a full multi-sensory experience, especially for something that is so multi-sensory as is wine. But, I always say that you could do a liberal arts degree with wine as the hub, because it ties to every facet of human endeavor, from history to agriculture, religion, science, commerce. And I just think that, it evokes from us that sort of deeper experience if you can combine the two. And of course, we know that memory and smell, which is really what we get from wine rather than taste, although it can taste good, but the memory and smell are the only... Smell is the only sense directly tied to memory. It doesn't have to go through a circuitous route in the brain. It's why, Proust starts out with his Madeleine, remembers everything. It's the smell, not the taste. But, so I would expect you'd want to have that full sensory, full circle experience. Yeah.
I love.
Okay.
I randomly came across a book. I don't know if you've seen this. I mentioned it in the book by a chap called Gordon Shepherd, I think his name is, and he devotes a book to neuroenology. So not just enology is the study of wine, but neuroenology. And he makes the exact point. He says, wine is. I think he says actually that wine is the single most kind of important drink in terms of in terms of engaging with our memories in different parts of the brain. And so there is something about that. I mean, like neurologically, kind of in our brains, there is something about the complexities and the smells and the taste and all these things of wine that that kind of latch on, as it were, to our memories. And so, yeah, so you're you're exactly right. I mean, it's fascinating.
It is. Sometimes, my husband thinks I'm a savant in that I'll remember the label of a wine we've had 12 years ago or something like that, and what I was wearing, what he was wearing, who was there, but it's just because the memory has been implanted from the deep sensory experience. I don't have that. I can't find my car keys half the time, so it is wine and affecting us slowly neurologically as opposed to, shooters and vodka or whatever. It's a different sensory experience with this particular type of alcohol. But you mentioned that Egyptian pottery from the palace of Amenhotep. There we go. The third, not to be confused with the second or the first, who ruled Egypt roughly 1390 to 1350 BCE, labels wine jars. He had these labels: wine for offerings, wine for taxes, wine for merrymaking, wine for a happy return. That sounds like your taxes. But if similar shards had survived from ancient Israel, what categories do you think they might have added?
I think there some of them are. I think there are some that are wine for the king. Wine for. I don't know if there are taxes. That's a good question. Whether there are taxed ones or not. But I do know that there are some shards, some pottery shards. It's a kind of wine for the king. It's just kind of the royal, the royal kind of household. Yeah, what else would they have said? Wine for festivals, wine for offerings. Maybe the ones in the temple, in Jerusalem later on would have said kind of, wine for offerings, because that was part of the daily offering in the Jerusalem temple was about, oh gosh, I think it was about half a bottle, or maybe it was almost a bottle. That they would pour out at the altar as part of the offering to God. So yes,
Right.
so I mean, most of the it's so fascinating, because I mean, this is the thing I think also that fascinates me about wine is that it was so much a part of the culture that there wasn't any. I mean, certainly when you get into wines for royalty and things like that, you're getting into kind of much nicer wines, but wine was such a it was just such a normal part of life. The more you read about it in Israel, the more you realize. I don't know if you've gone to France or kind of southern Italy or some of these areas where you can just go in wine country and it's just there's just vineyards everywhere.
It's everyday drink.
It's like literally everybody has a backyard, and everybody in everybody's backyard there's a vineyard. Whether it's an acre or kind of a quarter of an acre, it doesn't matter. And I like to
Right.
think that that's probably, a similar parallel with what ancient Israel was, because wine was such a critical daily drink. I mean, it was healthier than water. It was used for medicinal purposes. I mean, it was just one of these key agricultural, products that was just life sustaining. And so, I think anybody who could grow wine and did grow wine would. And so there is something about that is just so refreshing, because I think one of the things, and I'm sure that you've come across this in your wine career, is you can get into this world where wine just becomes something that is so so clinical and so snobby and so kind of everybody's got to have the right
Separated from the
word.
sensuality,
It's exactly. And it's
Happy
it's
joy.
it's one of these things that you just think like, no, actually, the way the Bible describes it, it doesn't matter if you're poor, if you're rich, if you're sitting around at a wedding feast as Jesus was with his disciples and Mary, people are just celebrating, even if the wine's terrible, people are still celebrating, I mean, this is part
Sure.
of the joy of the occasion. But yeah,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
that's the nice thing about, I think,
Yeah.
about kind of
Yeah.
studying biblical stuff on wine.
Absolutely. Now, the first meal you say in Scripture is, I'm going to butcher this.
Melchizedek.
Is there you go. Thank you.
Melchizedek.
Bringing
yes.
out.
Yes, you should know that too, because you know that the largest bottle is called a Melchizedek.
Oh,
yeah.
Look, I can barely say Nebuchadnezzar, so.
No, that's true. Yeah.
Melchizedek. I should remember that. Okay, so he brings out the bread and wine for Abraham after battle. What pattern starts there and runs all the way, do you think, to the Last Supper? What threads are there?
There's something about, because had Melchizedek brought out bread and water, if he just kind of gave Abraham sustenance, it would have been fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But would have been a sign of kind of, okay, here's some bread and water. This will kind of tide you over. This will sustain your body. But once you include wine in that meal, it kind of something elevates that meal. It becomes, and some biblical scholars will say that becomes a type of covenant meal. Covenant meaning just is kind of a legal document, or a legal kind of agreement in the Old Testament. Yeah, in the ancient world, that bound you to somebody else. And so some and it might very well be, it might very well have been a kind of a covenant ceremony at some point. But I think the point is that, and what's so wonderful about that is Abraham has just kind of saved the day, and he's done all this kind of military stuff and driven out the bad kings and brings peace to the land. And there is something about how that then relates to a kind of celebration, and the joy and the victory in this case that God has given Abraham, that Melchizedek celebrates as well. Early Christian kind of church, what they called the church fathers, the leaders of the church, interpreted kind of Melchizedek as a foreshadowing of Christ bringing bread and wine in the Eucharist. But I think what it does is it gives us a sense of the importance of wine and sitting down with someone kind of at the table, although it doesn't say that they're at a table, but sitting down with somebody and breaking bread and drinking wine just becomes this very powerful sign of kind of the bond between humanity, the celebration because of the gifts God's given. Again, we have these passages about lifting up the cup of salvation. Where do you do that? You do that around a dinner table. You do it around, a table at a feast. It's like we raise a glass to toast someone, whether at a wedding or a big banquet or whatever it is. And there's something so powerful about that, that gathering together, and that, and doing so over a glass of wine. I think that kind of makes it that much more special.
That communion. And I think I'm really rusty on this, but Jesus said, wherever bread is broken and wine is consumed, there I'll be. Like, I'll be with you when you do this.
Wherever two or three are gathered. Certainly
my name.
Certainly in the upper room, it's the drink this in remembrance of me. This is my blood of the new covenant. So it's the preparation for the actual Eucharist, the words that the priest would say, kind of to institute the Eucharist. But yeah, that's exactly it. It's kind of that reminder of, and I think obviously in the Christian faith, that's where wine kind of becomes, the ultimate symbol. It's in the Eucharist. Christians believe that, well, it depends on what Christians you talk to, but that the blood the blood of Christ is the wine, and so there is this kind of very significant. That very significant moment of this, of what's happening there, but it's being done through wine and through bread at the table. Yeah.
Now the 12 men that Moses sent out to scout the Promised Land bring back clusters of grapes so heavy 2 men have to carry it in on a pole between them. Yeah. So I guess grapes are visual proof that the Promised Land is worth fighting for. This is the symbol, again, another wine symbol, that this is what we've been waiting for, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that wonderful story of them coming back with the grapes on the pole. I mean, that's the national symbol of Israel, of the modern state of Israel. Um, is a
Okay.
wonderful, just a wonderful vision of kind of the fruitfulness of the land, but not only the fruitfulness, but the fact that you can make so much wine. And then and
Right.
we see similar things. It's I can't remember, it's in I can't remember the name of the text, but there's an ancient Egyptian text that talks about the wine flowing like rivers in the land of Canaan. The Egyptians always used to go and attack the what was called Palestine, or the land of Canaan, which is kind of modern day Israel and modern day Palestine and parts of Lebanon, and they talk about that the king's armies were, when they went there, because the rivers just, the wine flowed like rivers, the army was, they were just drunk every day. so so you
Sounds
do
like a
get,
good time to
no,
me.
exactly, so, yeah, I don't know
Yeah.
that your army would be worth very much if they were drunk every day, but so there's all these kind of testimonies of kind of this this wonderful fertility of the land,
Right.
but then the fact that the vines grow and produce so much wine is part of the mystique of the promised land, of this. It's just this place that's bursting
It's
with
abundance. Yes.
abundance and wine and life and all these types of things. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think I don't know if this is the same thing you're referring to, but you note that the Hebrew prophet Amos writes that the mountains shall drip sweet wine and all the hills
Yes.
shall flow with it. It's a beautiful metaphor, or
Mm.
visual in evocation. And then Isaiah's feast to mark the end of the world features well aged wines, strained clear, on God's holy mountain for all peoples. Why do you think it was well aged wine rather than young, and why open to everyone rather than just Israel?
Mm. So well-aged wine is, I mean, even the ancients knew that wine that is older usually gets better. So they knew that.
Better.
I mean,
Okay.
they also would
It
have
was the
drank
good
wine
stuff.
fresh,
Yeah.
exactly. But they knew that the good stuff exactly was stuck somewhere in an amphora in a cool space that was, when it was broken out, it was something absolutely special. And so there are some good quotes, from Greek and Roman authors about kind of the natures of old wine, and how the old wine is kind of always better. It's always the preferred wine. So the fact that God serves well-aged wines to His people, and invite and kind of creates this banquet. I mean, one of the things that's fascinating about that passage, that I find particularly fascinating, that I was doing my research, is that in correspondence with that, so there were these Canaanites, so these other tribes that lived around Israel when they lived in the land, had their own myths, and they had their own gods and all these other kinds of things. And there's a story of one of their gods, this god called Baal, and after his great victory, he and the other gods are, kind of I think 7 days or 14 days or something, like just having a bender, drinking so much wine, and it's like, this is what the gods do. And what's so fascinating about the biblical text is, it's not God kind of drinking, excessive and copious amounts of wine. It's God actually preparing a banquet table for His people to come and to drink wine. These well-aged wines that were probably only reserved for royalty. And there's something really, really kind of very different about how the biblical authors understood kind of the nature of God and the nature of His relationship with His people. And I think that banquet motif is such a critical one, and that carries over also into the New Testament. And that's part of the reason, why it's so important that Jesus was associated with wine, is because so much in the so about 200, give or take 200 years before Jesus is born, so before kind of 0 AD, there were all sorts of different Jewish writings that aren't in the Bible, but that are still, you can still kind of read them. And one of the things that was so interesting that I found was that there was so much about, or not so much, but there was an association with the Messiah, or the person who was to come and save everybody, in connection with the fertility of the vine. And so there are these passages where, the vine produces kind of so many grapes, and one grape makes 50 bottles. So it was just this kind of like these like obscene numbers, just of all, but all kind of representing this time of joy and celebration and salvation, which is why when Jesus changes so much wine, so much water into wine at the wedding of Cana, there is this underlying message there that this is the one, that this is not how we envisaged it. This is not exactly how we envisaged it, but like this is, he's the one who brings, the banquet, the banquet to his people. And so, so it's fascinating.
Now, the Cana, he converted, I guess the specifics are not the point of the story, but I'm fascinated by it. 20 to 30 gallons of water into 900 modern day bottles of wine, you say, or 5,400 glasses. Now, was that for a big wedding or wedding festivities that were going to go on all week? Why so much wine? That was just an incredible. Or did he just want to make a real point? Look, I can do it, people.
Make the statement. Yeah. I think there's all sorts of answers to that probably, but I think one of them on a practical note, which is why Mary, his mother, says to him, "Hey, they're out of wine," which, in Jesus's day would have been, just such a shameful sign, kind of the shame of the family is that they have this wedding. And the weddings back in Jesus's day would usually last up until a week. They'd probably be about a week long. So you can imagine that there was lots of wine consumed. And probably, I'm not sure how big, but you've got to think in that village, I don't know, maybe kind of 100 to 200 people, maybe, or something like that. A small village in Galilee. Yeah. And I'm sure that everybody would have been, a part of it, and it would have been a part of the festivities. And, I'm sure there was some that drank more than others. But the fact that, there was this, this wedding and this kind of crisis in the wedding of, how do you, in some ways, because the question is almost like, how do you celebrate without wine? It's like, the former Pope Francis's question, how do you keep this celebration that's so critical to the life of the family, to the life of the community, to everybody's celebration? And, and then Jesus provides this, absolute, extraordinary amount. And I think that is, such a critical part of saying, this isn't just about, that Jesus coming, at least kind of in the New Testament and certainly in John's Gospel, is not just about, how to say this, it's not just about, he's kind of coming to do a job or something like that. He's just coming to do this one thing. It's about this explosion and celebration of life, that if this truly is the Son of God, then this is, then the earth is going to respond. Wine is going to be consumed because the other great kind of metaphor in the Old Testament for God's salvation is the wedding banquet, this great feast, as you mentioned before. And so symbolically, physically, it's amazing, because I have a good story on that one. We used to take a group of students to Israel. So when I first started, this is kind of before pre-COVID, and we haven't done it in a while, but we used to take kind of busloads of students who wanted to go to see the Holy Land, and we'd always go up to Galilee and go to Cana. And so one year, I think it was the first or second year that we went, we stopped by the little village Cana, and we, a friend of mine said, "Oh, well, we have to buy a bottle of wine." And so we cracked it open that night at dinner, and no offense, maybe their wine's gotten better. I don't want to diminish the wine of Cana, but it was just one of the worst wines I think I'd ever drunk. And we just both started laughing, and we put down our glasses, and we said, "This is why the miracle was so amazing." It's because Jesus produced something. Exactly, he produced something that was actually people wanted to drink.
It was very funny. That's a great story. But you're right. It's not just the quantity. You also note in your book that the chief steward says, why did you save the good wine until
Mm,
now? Because, traditionally they serve the good wine first, and then as people became more and more inebriated and their
yeah.
senses more numb, they would bring out the schlocky stuff and people would notice. But that was also something Jesus, like, well, okay, they ran out and they came to Jesus and he performed the miracle, but it was the best wine too.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
saving the best for now, and that kind of that now is critical in kind of in John's gospel and the stories of Jesus, because that now is about this time in history, this
The
moment
coming.
where
Yeah.
the Son of God
Yeah.
has come. So yeah.
Yeah, the best wine is now. He is here.
Mm.
So now you count 26 vine related metaphors in the Bible and note that 22 of them appear in in prophecies of harsh judgment. So why
Mm.
did the prophets reach for wine when they wanted to kind of warn people?
I mean, I think again it goes back to the similar to the idea of what we were talking about before, that wine is becomes this sign of salvation. You have the cup of salvation, and I think what the prophets in the Old Testament are the poets of the Hebrew Bible. They're not just these predictors of the future. They're artists. They're poets. They use language in such a powerful way, like a poet or a playwright would. And so, what my sense of it is that they take the symbol, essentially, that kind of holds together this idea of God's blessing and salvation, which is the cup of wine, and they take this symbol and then they invert the metaphor. So what the cup of salvation is becomes kind of the poison chalice. So in the sense of, and it makes sense because for the average Israelite, that cup of salvation, and drinking that wine, would have been, one of the greatest things in life. And then
Right.
to hear the prophet kind of say, well, listen, if you live this way, like, if you live unethically, if you abuse people, if you cheat people, if you do all the things that I haven't, I've told you not to do, then it's going to be like drinking from a poisoned chalice. And so I think it just is one of these things that I get into the book, and a little bit in the book about metaphor theory, and why metaphors are so powerful, because they connect us to our physical experiences in the world, and then they kind of create that bridge between our physical experience and then what we can understand, kind of theologically or philosophically. And so I think that was probably why the prophets kind of use that, and then it comes in the book of Revelation at the end of the Bible as well, but use that idea of kind of drunkenness and this poison chalice as something, as a sign of kind of God's judgment, and that the enemy. I think the other thing in the drunkenness part is that if you're inebriated, it's a good time for your enemy to attack because you're not going to be able to defend yourselves. And so
Sure.
oftentimes that metaphor gets used in a way to say, drunken, kind of drunken Israel, or Israel has drunken from this cup, this cup of wrath, this cup of God's wrath. And because they have done so, their enemies now, like the Assyrians or later the Babylonians, are going to come and destroy them. And so yeah, so it becomes a really important kind of poetic tool, as it were. And it is
Yes.
very interesting to compare the two when you think of this idea of the cup of salvation and this blessing in life and all these great things, but then if you're not obedient to God's command, that cup of salvation just becomes this cup of wrath, and becomes this poison chalice. So yeah, it is an interesting one.
Yeah, that is. And you just brought to mind something else, like the cup of salvation, the poison chalice. Does Jesus pray in the Garden of Gethsemane, Lord, take this cup away from me?
Yes.
Is
And
that one
yeah,
of the
and I
metaphors he uses, right?
yeah, exactly. And yeah, I talk a little bit about that in the book. And that kind of expresses this, this cup of kind of suffering under the enemy, and Jesus will turn
Right.
himself over to Rome. Pilate will convict him, and the sense of then Rome will take his life, as he's crucified on the cross. And so that cup of suffering, that cup of that bearing a bearing a catastrophe, bearing this suffering under Roman power, that in the Christian kind of theology or idea is that was he was the only person who didn't deserve to drink that cup. The only person who walked the earth that didn't, shouldn't receive that, and yet he chose to drink from it. So yeah, exactly. That's a good point.
Wow. Okay, now the wisdom of wine. You say in Proverbs 23 contains what may be the world's first hangover passage, ending with the drunkard saying, "When shall I awake? I will seek another drink." That sounds like hair of the dog cure or something. What does it tell us about the sages who had such an intimate, almost comic knowledge of being hungover?
They did. I mean, there's some great there is some great Egyptian literature on this one as well. About the father going into kind of like the whorehouse and dragging his son out who's drunk with wine and saying, so you need to shape up. So not very unlike today probably. But yeah, no, the wisdom literature is wonderful. I mean, it's some of it is just very, very just very funny. It's kind of exactly what you said. It's just a perfect description.
It's kind of like that little buried sentence. If you don't read it slowly, you could skip right over it.
Yeah, I mean, the ancient people knew, kind of what it's like to go out and, on a drinking bender and then wake up the next day with bloodshot eyes and all of that kind of stuff. I mean, I think the great thing about the wisdom literature is it's so practical. It's kind of it's just these wisdom sayings and teaches you how to live and how to live rightly. And I think one of the important things in that is that this is where a lot of the kind of condemning drunkenness comes in, because to be wise you need to be about your wits. You need to be able to think, you need to be able to act properly, and so you get kind of instructions for how you should behave at a banquet when you're drinking, and and that was actually just as much a part of the Greco-Roman culture as well. And kind of banquet etiquette and things of that nature. But some of the things that I loved in the wisdom literature, excuse me, apart from those stories that you just mentioned, are again, wine becomes this metaphor for well, a lot of what people will call her Lady Wisdom. She's the one that the parents tell the son, you should pursue this Lady Wisdom. And there's this wonderful passage where, again, just like you mentioned with Isaiah, that she prepares this feast, that wisdom is like this banquet, this banquet of, she prepares her wines, and it says she has mixed wines. And so sometimes in the ancient world, they would mix wines with spices and different things. I mean, sometimes hallucinogenics, but, in this case, it's probably more, kind of different spices or honey or things of that nature. I mean, the Greeks were known for mixing their wines, usually with water or salt water even. But this idea that that wisdom is like, this banquet, if you live a wise life, if you act kind of according to wisdom, it's like sitting down at this banquet with these lovely, mixed wines and all of this kind of this wonderful stuff. So I think the Proverbs and another book is Ecclesiastes. And then it's not always included in the wisdom kind of category, but the Song of Songs, the love poetry in the Bible, all of them highlight wine, which again, it's just one of these things that I wasn't expecting there to be so much written about wine there, but it is.
Absolutely. Like, as you mentioned, the Song of Songs, the woman is saying, your love is better than wine. I mean, it's a very romantic kind of description as well. So from wrath to romance, I mean, it's just,
exactly.
It really does cover the whole gamut. Now, John the Baptist did not drink wine and was called demon-possessed. Jesus did drink wine and was called a glutton and a drunkard and a friend of tax collectors and sinners. He accepts the second label. He doesn't defend himself against it. Why doesn't he doesn't argue with how they're describing him. They even use the word, the Greek word something means drinker, but with a negative slant.
Yes, oinopates.
Enopates, yes, but it's closer to drunkard. Yeah. So what did he have to say about that? How did he react, or just he didn't?
Yeah, well, he didn't. I mean, I guess he did and he didn't. I think he goes on and uses kind of a story to. He talks about new wine in old wineskins and things of that nature. But I mean, the interesting thing, that I think Jesus would have experienced in his lifetime is that, obviously they didn't kind of level these criticisms against him without some element of truth being involved. And the likelihood is that Jesus would have, as a typical Jew growing up in Galilee around that time, he would have celebrated the Sabbath every week. And most likely they would have had wine at the Sabbath if they were able to afford it. And I think it would have been an important part of that. But even if someone argues, well, you can't say he drank wine at the Sabbath, but I think he did. He certainly would have had wine growing up at, the Passover festival, at other festivals that the Jews celebrated throughout the year. And so I think the criticism of him as a drunkard and a glutton, means that, the element of truth in it is not that he was a drunkard or a glutton, but the element of truth is that he was out eating and drinking with, people who were, people. Yeah, exactly. The people that the Pharisees thought were, the sinners of society. And so that's a fascinating thing, that one, that they call him that, but two, that, that they're so annoyed by it. They're just really annoyed that he's out kind of drinking and carousing, which, not that he's carousing, but you know what I mean? I find that fascinating, that it says something about, again, how, I mean, and this is the kind of, I think, my argument throughout the whole book, but again, it says something about the importance of wine. The importance not only of sitting down and drinking with other people and eating with other people around the table, but the importance symbolically of Jesus's connection to his, what we call a messianic, or his being the Messiah. And this idea of, as we said in the wedding of Cana, this idea of the wedding banquet, this idea of, God coming to his people and the celebration that's involved. And all of those things are, they're kind of given, they're given life, or they're given meaning through the things that he does, whether it's healing people or doing all sorts of other stuff. But I think an important part of it is that he sat down with people and drank wine and broke bread
at their level, at their humble tables.
Yeah, exactly.
Like his communion was literally like what they were drinking, because they had foretold, some had foretold the Messiah would be coming on a big horse and full of armor and very fancy. But he's this humble man who's actually drinking their really bad wine at Cana, or maybe his own good wine. And but meeting them where they're at. Yeah, that's great.
And that's such an important part about it, and it gets back to that idea of wine being, not a drink for the wealthy, but a drink that can be, could have been made by anybody. Even a poor farmer could have dedicated, kind of an acre of his land or a quarter acre or whatever it was to produce wine for the family and for himself. And so again, just going back to that idea that it was a drink that marked special occasions, but it was just a drink that also marked life and joy and living, and and Jesus being present with people around the table. I mean, I think that is such a powerful witness.
Mm-hmm. It definitely is. Now, you mentioned the parable of new wine in old wineskins. It's something we hear a lot these days, used in different contexts. But is this meaning Jesus rejected Judaism for something new, or you read it almost the opposite way? What was he saying when he said new wine in old wineskins?
Yeah, so this is it's somewhat complicated. It's not super complicated. I'll try to make it as simple as possible. So the idea is so he says, they basically criticize him and John the Baptist for, he's a drunkard, he's the drunkard and the glutton, and John the Baptist is kind of this one who's fasting, and both of them are wrong somehow. And so what he says is that no one takes new wine and puts it into an old wineskin. So you can imagine a dried, kind of almost crusty old wineskin. And if you put something new in it, like new wine, that's maybe it hasn't fully been fermented yet, and there's still some sort of kind of fermentation going on, if it's in a flexible skin, then it would kind of, you can let out a bit of the gas and things like that. But if it's in an old wine skin, it's going to burst and it's going to blow up. Now, traditionally, Christians have argued that Jesus is saying, all of the old stuff in the Old Testament, all the old laws, that's like the old wineskin, and Jesus is the new wine. But actually, the passage is I don't think it's saying that at all. So actually, the passage is kind of within the context of discipleship. So Jesus, the Pharisees are criticizing Jesus and his disciples for eating and drinking, basically. And so Jesus is saying, look, you can't take, you have to take old wine and put it in the old wineskin. There's nothing wrong with new wine or old wine. There's the comparison. It's more of the substances you're mixing together, the new wine. So he says, so I think what he's saying is, look, you can't take the new teachings. So the Pharisees had, these Jewish teachers and rabbis had had kind of additional teachings to the Bible and to what God gave to Moses in the Old Testament. And so these additional teachings, I would say, are like the new wine. And they're trying to shove them into kind of the old wineskin, which is more kind of Moses and the law and what we think of as given at Mount Sinai. And so what Jesus is saying is actually that his teaching is like old wine, that you can put in an old wineskin. And then there's, in Luke's gospel, at the end of that passage, it says, and no one after drinking the new will want to drink it because they'll say the old is better. And that's kind of classic, and basically in almost all of like ancient Greek and Roman writings, everybody always wants old wine. You just don't want new wine. I mean, you drink new wine, but it's like, but you always want the old wine because it's better. And so the idea is that Jesus's teaching and his coming and, this kind of, all the things that are happening through him is like old wine in old wineskins. It is what he offers is the kind of 100-year-old Chateau Lafite or something. This is like, he's giving the people the best, whereas the Pharisees with their new teachings and their new kind of, and their new ways are actually trying to shove in new wine into what God has already given in this old wineskin, and then it bursts, and then nothing good comes of it. So that's my interpretation. Some disagree with me, I'm sure, but it's
okay.
But I think that's what he's saying.
That works for me. Now, in Revelation, has Christ treading the great winepress of God's wrath with blood flowing as high as a horse's bridle for a distance of about 200 miles. Is this just a vision?
Yeah.
What does it mean?
Yes.
In two or three sentences.
So my take on the book of Revelation is just that all of these symbols, it's what sometimes is called an apocalyptic text, meaning apocalypse just means to unveil something, to lift up and to see. And so there's very specific symbolism going on. And so that graphic symbol of kind of miles and miles and miles and gallons of blood like wine, I think is ultimately a symbol of, for Christians who are reading this, that God will ultimately destroy all evil. That there is a time, and I think this is kind of this is one of the messages of Revelation is that there is a time when Christ will come, and that again, that excess of Christ treading on the grapes and blood pouring out for miles. I mean, it's just really gross and really graphic. But I think the symbolism of it is that everything that is not good will be destroyed. And then ultimately, in the end of Revelation, you have this wonderful vision of the kind of New Jerusalem coming down, and this stream flowing out to the nations. And on either side are these trees that are constantly blooming. And so I make a fairly spurious argument that potentially on those trees would have been vines, because it wasn't uncommon in the Old Testament period to grow fig trees, and sometimes they would trellis the vines up the fig tree. So the trees would basically act as trellises for the vines. So it's very possible that some of the fruit that is growing on those trees are grapes for the new kingdom. And one of my friends disagrees with me on this one, but I'll still hold to my
Why not?
hold to my guns on
Who's
that.
Who's going to prove it one way or the other?
Exactly. We'll have to wait and see.
Yeah. In the end, we'll all find out. Oh, you were right.
Exactly.
Well, Jesus said he is the vine. I mean, there's just so much, that we could explore. But since we don't have till the end of time, let me ask you if you could share a bottle of wine with anyone outside the wine world, living or dead, who would that be for you, Mark? And which wine would you open?
Oh, gosh. Oh, that's a tough one. I mean, obviously, it would be really fun to be a fly on the wall or sit down at the table, with Jesus and the other kind of sinners.
Why not?
Sinners
Go right to the top.
table. I mean, that would be really fun. I think as an Old Testament scholar, I think I would have loved to sit kind of on the top of Mount Sinai with Moses, and I would crack open it would have to be a simple wine. It couldn't be something, kind of overly fancy, or, maybe something from kind of southern Italy, like a Abruzzo or something like that. It would have to be a simple, a kind of a basic wine, maybe something from southern France or something like that. But I think it would just be, I think I'd just love to have a chat with Moses over just a really lovely, simple glass of wine. Ask him. I don't know what I would ask him. I would ask him about
what would you ask him?
How do you feel after the Exodus? I don't know. How do you feel about going to the Promised Land? But yes, I could imagine myself on the top of Mount Sinai with the sun going down. Probably have a pottery cup. It would probably be something made out of pottery, and just sipping something with Moses. I think that would be a treat.
Well, that sounds like the end of our movie, naturally closing, and there they are on the hilltop. The sun is coming down.
Exactly.
That's perfect. Mark, this has been wonderful. Is there anything we haven't covered? I mean, I know there's a lot we haven't covered, but is there anything you wanted to mention as we wrap up?
No, I think we've covered so much. I mean, it's been an amazing conversation. I think we've actually covered almost the whole book. But yeah,
wow.
I mean, it's just one of these lovely things, and it's I mean, I think the other thing, and this is just the other part of what comes out in the book is just the importance of, not only wine in kind of terms of the joy of our humanity and all these other types of things, but wine as it kind of informs us about about who we are as human beings, but then also how we relate to God's creation. I mean, I think that's one of the other things that's so critical that wine can teach us. I mean, I do have I'll throw a plug in. It's not going to come out until probably next March or something like that. But I've written a more kind of popular level book with the title "The Cup of Salvation: How the Fruit of the Vine Can Save the World." And so it's
that's catchy.
It's a much. I'll send you a copy when it comes out. But
yes, please.
But it focuses. I mean, it's about it's about kind of, again, what it means to be human, and we're living in this age that is, there's just so many questions being raised, whether it's with AI or, or just the technologies that we have about what it means to be a human being. And, some of the stuff that we were talking about, sitting around the table, having a feast, having a banquet, paying attention to one another, not looking at your phone. I mean, all of these things, I think, are ways that wine can help us kind of reconnect with not only who we are as human beings, but how we connect to God's creation, but maybe most importantly, how we connect with one another. And just being able to sit around the table, being able to enjoy a glass of wine, not having to be pretentious about it, but just getting to, enjoy people's company and enjoy that part of what it means to be human. So I think that's the other thing about wine, and I'm sure you've experienced it in your own life and in your own days. But that I think is just such an important thing about what it can teach us.
Amen. That's great.
There we go.
Yeah. All right. So, Mark, your book is available, I assume, on all the bookstores, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Chapters, Waterstones, all the places people can order your book, and we'll put links in the show notes so that they can find it. Is there any other links or anything you wanted to mention, either for your book or for yourself?
No, it should be out. I mean, I'm still waiting for it to come out in paperback. It should be out. And then the other book, as I was saying, will come out kind of in the spring. But no, people can look on social media or wherever. I'm around there often, sometimes posting wine stuff and other things like that.
That's great. Oh, this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much, Mark. It was just wonderful. Thank you for taking the time. I'm going to say goodbye for now, but don't log off just yet. But thank you. Really appreciate all your stories, and I've learned so much.
Yeah, thank you, Natalie. It's been so much fun to chat about it.
Okay, great. All right, cheers.
Bye.